The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Not through any diplomatic channel, not through the encrypted quantum relay that Earth's Space Affairs Bureau had spent 11 years building. It came through a public radio frequency that any civilian with a basic receiver could pick up. The message was short. It named one person. It gave a set of coordinates. It gave a date. It named Nora Vance. Nora was not a general. She was not a scientist or an admiral or a head of state. She was a mid-level diplomatic observer who had spent the last 9 years attending meetings that never produced anything and writing reports that nobody read. Her office was on the 4th floor of a building in Geneva that smelled like old carpet. She had a plant on her desk that she kept forgetting to water. When the bureau chief called her in and showed her the message on a screen, she read it twice and then asked if there was any coffee. There was not. She said that was fine. The Galactic Council had chosen her specifically. The message said so. It did not explain why. It said she was to come alone, that she would be given observer status only, that she would have no voting rights and no legal standing, and that the session she was attending had already been decided. She was being invited to watch, not to speak. The bureau chief told her she did not have to go. She said she would go. The journey to Station Verath took 19 days on a transit vessel the council sent without a crew. The ship flew itself. Nora spent the time reading the council's public records, all 430 years of them. She made notes in a small paper notebook she had bought at the airport. By the time the station appeared on the forward display, the notebook was halfway full. Station Verath was not what she had imagined. She had seen the images, everyone on Earth had, but images did not carry the scale of it. It was built into the side of a dead moon, carved directly into the rock over centuries. The docking bay alone was large enough to hold every stadium on Earth with room left over. Lights ran in long, cold lines across the ceiling far above. Hundreds of ships from dozens of species sat in their berths, each one different, each one enormous. Nora walked off the transit vessel with her notebook under one arm and a small bag over her shoulder. A council attendant, a short creature with 4 arms and pale green skin, met her at the ramp. It did not speak. It held up a flat screen showing a map of the station and pointed to a corridor. She followed. The corridors of Station Verath were built for species much taller than humans. The ceilings arched high overhead, carved from dark stone and etched with symbols that repeated in long rows. The air was cool and carried a faint smell like metal and rain. Other beings moved through the corridors in groups, in robes, in armor, in things that were neither. None of them looked at her for long. The assembly chamber was at the center of the station. She heard it before she saw it. A low hum of many voices, many languages running through translation systems that flattened everything into something almost comprehensible. Then the door opened and the sound hit her fully, and the size of the room made her stop for just 1 second. It was circular. It rose in tiers, curved desks arranged in rings that climbed upward like the inside of a shell. Every tier was filled. Hundreds of delegations, each species with their own section, their own lighting preferences, their own atmospheric units humming quietly beside their seats. At the center of the floor below was a single speaker's circle lit from above by a beam of white light. The attendant led her to the back of the lowest tier. There was no desk waiting for her. There was a folding chair. Nora looked at the chair. She looked at the nearest alien delegation, tall figures in layered dark robes who did not look back. She sat down, opened her notebook to a fresh page, and uncapped her pen. At the elevated central podium, the council speaker rose. He was a Drell, she knew from her reading. Tall, broad, with dark ridged skin and eyes that caught the light like glass. His robes were deep red. When he raised one hand, the chamber went quiet in a way that felt immediate and total, like a switch had been thrown. He began to read. The resolution was formal and long and carefully worded. Nora wrote down every phrase that mattered. Permanent quarantine. Full communication blackout. no galactic trade access, no travel rights beyond a defined boundary around the solar system, indefinite duration pending review, with review to be scheduled at the Council's discretion. She wrote it all down. When the speaker finished reading, he set the document down and looked at the chamber. He said the evidence would now be presented. He said the vote would follow. He did not look at Nora. An alien delegate 2 rows ahead of her turned and looked at her over one shoulder. It had no visible eyes, but she had the strong impression it was looking at her anyway. After a moment it turned back. Nora kept writing. The chamber settled into the rhythm of procedure. Translators hummed. Delegates conferred in low voices. The lights above the speaker's circle stayed on, waiting for whoever would stand in them next. Nora uncrossed her legs, crossed them the other way, and kept her pen moving. She had 19 pages of notes already. She was not close to done. The first delegate to speak was from the Veloran Assembly. Nora had read about the Velorans. They were one of the oldest species in the Council, 3,000 years of recorded interstellar history, known for precision and long memory. Their delegate was tall and thin with smooth silver skin and fingers that were one joint too long. It moved to the speaker's circle with the kind of ease that came from having done something 1,000 times. It spoke in Veloran. The translation came through a small device clipped to the edge of Nora's folding chair, provided by the attendant who had brought her there without explanation. The voice in her ear was flat and careful. The Veloran delegate presented numbers. Human warfare statistics going back 600 years. Conflicts counted by decade, casualties organized by scale, resources destroyed listed in units the translator rendered as approximate Earth equivalents. It was thorough. It was also accurate. Nora had read enough history to know the figures were not exaggerated. If anything, they were conservative. The Veloran did not editorialize. It simply read the numbers in a calm, even voice, and let them sit in the chamber like stones dropped in still water. When it finished, it returned to its seat, without looking at the human in the back corner. The next to speak was the Drell secondary delegate, different from the speaker, a shorter version of the same species with copper-colored ridges instead of dark ones. It presented something Nora had not expected: medical data. Human diseases, the ones that had swept across continents before vaccines, the ones that had spread into animal populations, the ones that had mutated and returned. The delegate made a specific point about biological unpredictability. It used a phrase the translator gave her as uncontrolled internal contamination risk. Nora wrote that phrase down and underlined it. The Sulhari came third. Their philosopher was old, she could tell even without knowing exactly what age looked like on that species. It moved slowly to the speaker's circle, leaning on a staff carved from something that looked like bone. It did not bring data screens or holographic displays. It spoke from memory. It talked about human psychology, about short-term thinking, about the gap between what humans said and what humans did. It referenced specific events in Earth history, treaties broken within years of signing, environmental commitments abandoned for economic reasons, aid packages that arrived too late or not at all. It spoke without anger. It spoke with something closer to sadness. That was somehow harder to sit through than the numbers. Nora kept writing. There was a brief recess. Delegates broke into small clusters. The attendant brought Nora a cup of something warm that was not coffee or tea but had a similar effect on her alertness. She drank it and kept her eyes on her notebook. A Marin delegate approached her during the recess. The Marin were insectoid, jointed in ways that looked wrong until you stopped comparing them to anything from Earth. This one stopped about 2 meters away from Nora and tilted its head at an angle that the Marin physiological file in her memory identified as inquiry. It asked, through the translation device, if she had been told why she specifically was chosen. She said no. It said that was interesting. Then it returned to the Marin section without explaining what it found interesting about that. Nora wrote the exchange down. When the session resumed, the Marin delegation presented their evidence. They played a recording. It was footage of a human news broadcast, a political debate from 8 years ago. On screen, two humans shouted over each other about an infrastructure bill while a panel of commentators added their own noise over the top. The recording ran for 4 minutes. The chamber watched it. Several delegates exchanged looks. One Veloran leaned toward another and said something that the translator did not catch. The Marin delegate said, simply, "This is how humans make decisions." Nobody laughed. The silence was worse than laughter would have been. One more delegation spoke before the lunch interval. The Turi, a species Nora had only briefly encountered in her reading, presented something unexpected. They had been observing human online communication networks for decades. Not news, not government statements, but ordinary human conversation. The data they presented was about the volume of cruelty in those spaces. The comments, the messages, the anonymous statements humans made to each other when they believed no one was watching. The Turi delegate said, "We did not need to search for the worst examples. The worst examples found us immediately." Nora stopped writing for a moment. She looked at the speaker's circle. She looked at the beam of white light waiting there. Then she looked back at her notebook and kept going. She had been in the chamber for 6 hours. Her chair was uncomfortable. The translation device in her ear had started to give her a faint headache. Nobody had spoken to her except the Marin delegate and the attendant who refilled her cup without being asked. Across the chamber, on the highest tier, the council speaker watched everything with the stillness of someone who had already made up their mind. He had not looked at Nora again since the session began. She noticed, she wrote it down. The interval came and the chamber emptied slowly. Nora stayed in her chair. She turned to a fresh page. She wrote 3 words at the top of it. Then she looked at them for a long time, put the cap back on her pen, and waited for the session to resume. The afternoon session began with a procedural announcement. The council speaker read from a prepared statement. He said that in accordance with Article 41 of the Grand Assembly Charter, any observer present at a resolution hearing was entitled to 60 seconds of floor address before the final vote was cast. He said this was a formality, a courtesy extended by tradition. He said it had not been exercised in over 200 years. His tone made clear he did not expect it to be exercised today. He asked if the human observer wished to use this provision. The chamber was quiet. Several delegates turned to look at the back corner where Nora sat. Some of them had not looked at her at all during the morning session. She was not sure some of them had known she was there. She stood up. There was a murmur through the chamber, not loud, just a change in the texture of the silence. The Veloran delegate's fingers stilled on its desk. The Marin delegate that had spoken to her during the recess tilted its head at that same angle from before. Nora capped her pen, set her notebook on the folding chair, and walked to the speaker's circle. The walk was longer than it looked. The chamber floor was wide and flat, and the distance from the back wall to the center felt like it expanded slightly as she crossed it. On either side, rising upward in their curved tiers, hundreds of alien faces watched her. Different shapes, different sizes, different kinds of eyes or no eyes at all. She kept her pace steady. She did not hurry and she did not slow down. When she stepped into the speaker's circle, the light came from directly above, white and clean and slightly warm. She stopped in the center of it. She looked up at the tiered rings of delegates. She turned slowly, not dramatically, just enough to take in the full circle of the room. The speaker at his elevated podium had his hand raised. It was the hand he would lower to signal the vote. He had not lowered it yet. Nora looked at him, he looked at her. She spoke. Her voice was steady and quiet, and the translation systems in the chamber picked it up cleanly and carried it to every seat in every tier without distortion. She said, "We forgive you." Then she stopped speaking. The 60 seconds were not used up. She had used 3 words and 3 seconds, and then she stood there in the light and said nothing more. The speaker's hand did not come down. Around the chamber, motion stopped. A Drell delegate who had been reaching for a water vessel left its hand where it was. A Solhari who had been reviewing a data screen set it face down on the desk without looking at it. 2 Veloran delegates who had been conferring in low voices went silent so suddenly that the silence itself seemed to have a sound. Nobody spoke. Nora stayed in the circle. She had not moved to leave. She was not looking at any one delegate. She was looking at the chamber as a whole, the way she had looked at rooms full of difficult people for the past 9 years in Geneva. Waiting. Not impatiently, just waiting. The speaker said, very carefully, in a tone that had lost some of its professional flatness, "Can you clarify?" It was not a question with a question mark. It came out as something closer to a request. Nora said that she had used her 60 seconds. She said she had nothing to clarify. Another silence. This one lasted longer. A Tiri delegate near the middle tier stood without being recognized by the speaker, which was a breach of procedure that nobody moved to correct. It said, through its own translation system, that it did not understand what had just happened. The Marin delegate, in its jointed way of moving, leaned forward over its desk and said that it understood what the human had said. It said understanding the words and understanding the meaning were 2 different things, and it was not sure it had the second one. The Solhari philosopher in the back row had not moved at all. It was the stillest thing in the room. Its staff rested across its knees. Its eyes, half-lidded and ancient, were fixed on Nora in the speaker's circle. The Veloran primary delegate said, formally and correctly, addressing the speaker, "The observer's statement requires a response from the chair." The speaker said nothing for a moment. He looked at his hand, which was still raised. He looked at the chamber. He looked at Nora. He lowered his hand. He did not lower it to signal the vote. He just lowered it, resting it on the podium edge. His expression was not readable to Nora. She had not expected it to be. She had spent 9 years learning to read human faces in difficult rooms, and alien faces were a different text entirely. But his hand had come down, and the vote had not started. That was something. Nora walked back across the chamber floor to her folding chair. The walk felt different in the other direction. Still long, still watched, but the texture of the watching had changed. She sat down and picked up her notebook and opened it to the page with the 3 words written at the top. Below the words she wrote the time. Then she underlined all 3 words once, neatly, and waited to see what happened next. The confusion in the chamber was not loud. That was the thing Nora noticed first. She had been in rooms full of confused humans before, and confused humans made a lot of noise. They talked over each other. They raised their voices. They asked the same question in different ways, hoping a different version of it would produce the answer they were looking for. The Galactic Council went quiet. The kind of quiet that meant something was being processed that the usual systems could not handle. She had seen it once before, in a small meeting in Oslo where a junior delegate had accidentally said the one true thing in a room full of people who had spent years carefully avoiding it. The room had gone exactly this quiet. Nothing moved. Nobody spoke. And then, slowly, carefully, the pieces had started to fall. The Veloran primary delegate was the first to formally address the speaker again. It stood, was recognized, and said that the statement made by the human observer appeared to be directed not at the resolution, but at the council itself. It asked the speaker to clarify the procedural status of such a statement. The speaker said he was not certain. Several delegates wrote things down. One of the Drell at a lower tier stood and asked if the word forgive in the human language was equivalent to the concept the translation systems had rendered. The translation attendants checked with each other. They said the translation was accurate. They said the human word forgive carried additional layers in its original language that were difficult to fully carry across. The Drell delegate asked what layers. The translation attendant hesitated and said something close to, "The releasing of a claim you were entitled to keep." There was another silence. The Solhari philosopher, who had still not moved from its position since Nora returned to her seat, finally shifted. It placed its staff against the edge of its desk and folded its long hands together in its lap. Then it spoke, not loudly but in a tone that carried clearly. "The human has stated that she releases a claim. The claim being released is a claim against this council, for something done without her people's knowledge or consent." The chamber absorbed this. Nora kept her pen still. She was listening now, not writing. A young Marin delegate, not the one that had spoken to her earlier but another from the same section, stood up without being fully recognized. It said, "We have never been forgiven before, not by a species we were judging. Is this normal for humans?" Nobody answered immediately. The question sat in the chamber for a long moment. Then the Veloran primary delegate, in a careful and precise voice, said, "According to all data presented today, human behavior is inconsistent. It is not possible to determine if this is normal." The young Marin delegate said, "But she is here. She came alone. She sat in the back with a folding chair and a paper notebook while we presented evidence of everything wrong with her species, and then she forgave us." Another delegate, one of the Turi, said from its tier, "She did not ask for anything in return." The young Marin said, "I noticed that too." The speaker called for order. Order was technically maintained, but the quality of the silence that followed was different from the silence of procedure. It had more weight in it. Nora looked at her notebook. She looked at the 3 words written at the top of the page. She had written them the night before on the transit vessel, during the last hour of the journey, when the station had appeared on the display, and she had understood fully for the first time that she was going to arrive, and sit in a room, and be shown evidence of everything terrible about her species by beings who had already decided what to do about it. She had thought about what she could say. She had pages of arguments. She had statistics about human cooperation and human kindness and human medical aid sent to disaster zones in countries that had nothing to offer in return. She had prepared rebuttals to every point she thought they might make. Some of those rebuttals were good. She had worked hard on them. Then she had thought about why none of it would matter. The council had already made up its mind. Arguments would be received as defense. Defense would be received as confirmation that the species felt guilty. Guilt would confirm the resolution. She could argue perfectly and lose completely. But nobody could argue against being forgiven. Forgiveness was not a position that could be defeated by counter-evidence. You could refuse it, which was its own kind of answer, or you could receive it, which was a different kind of answer entirely. She had written the 3 words and looked at them for a long time on the vessel. She was looking at them again now. On the upper tier, the Solhari philosopher stood. It was granted the floor immediately, without procedural delay. When it spoke, its voice was slower than before, as if it was choosing each word with more care than usual. It said, "In 3,000 years of this council, no species under resolution has ever addressed us. They have always addressed the resolution. They have defended, explained, apologized, or refused. This human addressed us. That is a different thing." It sat back down. The chamber did not produce a sound for several seconds. The speaker looked at his hands on the podium. Then he looked at Nora in the back corner. She met his gaze across the enormous width of the room. She did not look away. She did not look challenging. She just looked at him the way she had looked at difficult people in small rooms for 9 years. Patient, present, still there. He reached for the procedural guide beside him. He had not reached for it once in the entire session. It was the kind of book you reached for when you were not sure what the rules said about something that had not happened before. Nora wrote that down. By the second hour after Nora's statement, the chamber had divided itself without anyone calling for a division. It happened gradually. Delegates began conferring within their own sections, then across sections, in ways that cut differently from before. The Drell's secondary delegate moved to sit with the Tiri for a period. Two Veloran delegates spent 40 minutes in quiet conversation with a Solhari Jr. The young Marin who had asked whether forgiveness was normal for humans kept looking across the room at Nora's corner, with an expression that Nora's translation device was not equipped to interpret. The speaker watched all of it from his podium. He had not called for the vote. He had not officially suspended the session. The procedural guide sat open on the podium beside him, but Nora had not been able to see which page he had stopped on. Then a Drell delegate she had not heard speak before asked to be recognized. It was one of the older ones, with darker ridges and a slower way of moving that suggested either age or seniority. The speaker gave it the floor. The delegate said, "This body has spent 2 sessions presenting evidence about what humans have done. It has not once asked what humans want." A Veloran delegate responded immediately. What a species wants is not relevant to a quarantine resolution. Quarantine is a protective measure, not a negotiation. The Drell delegate said, "We asked what they have done. We did not ask why. We did not ask what they were trying to do when they did it. We did not ask what they believe or what they fear or what they are building toward. We collected data about behavior and called it a complete picture." The Veloran said, "Behavior is what affects other species." The Drell said, "Behavior without context is just a list of events. We have very long lists. We do not have context." From the Solhari section, the philosopher spoke again without standing. Its voice was quiet, but the chamber had learned by now to go still when it spoke. It said, "We watched them for 200 years. We recorded their transmissions, mapped their conflicts, studied their biology. We built a file. The file is accurate, but a file is not a conversation." The young Marin delegate said, loudly enough that it required no recognition, "We never talked to them." The speaker said, "That is not a procedural." The young Marin said, "It is not a procedural point. It is the point. We are about to permanently seal off an entire species and we have never spoken to them. Not once. Not one conversation." The speaker said, "The observer is present. Communication has been established." The young Marin looked at Nora in the back corner and said, "She was given a folding chair and 60 seconds. That is not a conversation." A Veloran delegate called the remark out of order. 2 Drell delegates said simultaneously that they did not believe it was out of order. A Tiri delegate began referencing a charter article that the speaker interrupted twice before giving up and letting it finish. Nora had been writing continuously for 20 minutes. Her hand was starting to ache. She switched the pen to her other hand and kept going. The argument in the chamber was not clean or organized. It did not follow the structure that the morning session had followed. It was loud in patches and very quiet in others. Several delegates spoke simultaneously. The speaker called for order 4 times in 12 minutes and achieved it only partially. The chamber had broken out of its procedural rhythm, and nobody was quite sure how to get it back, or whether they wanted to. In the middle of it, the Marin delegate who had spoken to her during the recess, the older one, crossed the chamber floor and came to stand near Nora's chair. It did not approach too closely. It stood a few meters away, in a posture that felt in some way like it was addressing her privately despite the very public surroundings. It said, quietly enough that only the translation device caught it, "You knew that argument would not work." Nora said she knew. It said, "You also knew forgiveness would not necessarily work. There was no guarantee." She said there never was. It looked at her notebook. It said, "You have been writing since the session began. What are you writing?" She said she was writing everything down. It asked why. She said because someone should. The Marin was quiet for a moment. Then it said, "Humans document things." She said yes, everything. Wars, discoveries, recipes, arguments, apologies, jokes. Everything got written down somewhere. Even the things humans were ashamed of. especially those. The Marin said, "We found that strange. In our research, the documentation of failure." Nora said it was how they tried not to repeat things. It did not always work, but they kept trying. The Marin looked at her for another moment, then returned to its section without another word. On the floor, the speaker had finally restored enough order to make a formal announcement. He said the vote on the resolution would be postponed. He said a procedural review had been requested by multiple delegations and that the review required 48 hours. He said the session was suspended until further notice. He did not look at Nora when he said any of it. Delegates began to move. The chamber noise shifted from argument to the lower sound of departure. The attendant appeared at Nora's side to guide her out. She finished her sentence, capped her pen, and closed the notebook. She stood up. The folding chair sat empty behind her. Around the chamber, species that had existed for thousands of years were talking to each other about a human woman and 3 words, and a thing that had no category in 430 years of council records. She followed the attendant to the corridor. Outside the chamber, the station air was cool and smelled like metal and rain. She had 48 hours. She went to find something to eat and kept the notebook close. The 48 hours were not quiet. Nora's quarters on Station Verath were a small room near the lower docking levels, clearly not designed for human proportions. The ceiling was higher than necessary, and the furniture was wrong in ways that were hard to name exactly. She slept badly and ate whatever the station's food system produced when she described things she was willing to try. Most of it was acceptable. One thing was not. She didn't write that one down. Delegates came to find her. Not officially. No appointments were made through the bureau channel she had been given access to. But across those 2 days, 7 different delegates found their way to the corridor outside her quarters or to the small common area where she sat in the mornings writing her notes. They came one at a time. They did not send representatives. They came themselves, which she understood from her reading to be unusual. The young Marin delegate came first. It sat across from her in the common area and said nothing for a while, which she had also read was a Marin way of beginning a conversation. She waited. Then it asked her, very directly, what humans believed happened after death. She said it depended on the human. It asked what she believed. She said she was not sure, but that she found the uncertainty more interesting than frightening most days. The Marin was quiet again. Then it said, "We have a word in our language for the comfort found in shared uncertainty. It does not translate well, but I think you understand the thing it describes." She said she thought she did. The Solhari philosopher came on the second morning. It was the longest visit. It sat with her for nearly 2 hours and asked about human history, not the disasters, not the wars, but the recoveries. It wanted specific examples of times humans had done something terrible and then done something differently afterward. She talked. It listened. When she mentioned the international agreements on nuclear testing from the 20th century, it asked her to explain the reasoning that led humans to agree to limit their own weapons. She explained. It said, "You constrained your own power. Voluntarily." She said yes. It said, "We did not include that in our files." She said she knew. Before it left, it said something she wrote down carefully. "We have spent 2 centuries studying what you are. We did not spend a single day asking what you were trying to become." On the second evening, the Drell who had spoken about context during the argument came to find her. It was brief. It told her the speaker had requested a private summary of the conversations delegates had been having with her. It asked if she objected to that summary being shared. She said she did not object. She asked if the speaker was going to attend one of these conversations himself. The Drell paused and said that was not impossible. Then it left. The speaker did not come. But on the morning of the 3rd day, when the session reconvened, Nora arrived to find that the folding chair had been replaced. In its place was a proper desk, smaller than the others but the same construction, the same dark material, set not in the back corner but at the edge of the lowest tier. It had a translation unit built in and a small panel of lights that indicated active participant status. She stood in front of it for a moment. The attendant appeared at her side and said with careful neutrality that the desk was provisional. She said she understood. She sat down. The speaker called the session to order. He announced that the resolution on human quarantine had been withdrawn by procedural motion, supported by the minimum required number of delegations. He read the names of the species that had filed the motion. There were 9 of them. The Marin were first on the list. The Sulhari were second. The Drell were on the list. The Velorans were not, but 3 Veloran delegates had filed a formal abstention rather than a vote in support, which was, Nora had been told, the Veloran version of reconsidering. He announced that a new category had been proposed for Earth, provisional contact status, not membership, not an alliance, something that did not have a precedent because it had not existed before, a status that meant the conversation could continue, that the files could be opened and questions could be asked and answers could be given on both sides over time. He read the terms, she wrote them all down. When he finished, he looked at her. The first direct look he had given her since the first session. His expression was still not easy to read, but he spoke to her directly for the first time since he had asked if she wanted to use her 60 seconds. He said, "The Council does not understand humans." She said, "I know." He said, "That was not a criticism." She said, "I know that too." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "The philosopher told me what you said about documentation, about writing down the failures." She waited. He said, "We do not do that. We record achievements. We record advancements. We do not record the things we got wrong." She said, "That must make it hard to know what to fix." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "The session will continue." She opened her notebook to a fresh page. Around the chamber, hundreds of alien faces looked at the small desk at the edge of the lowest tier where a human woman sat with a paper notebook and a pen. Some of them had expressions she could not read. Some she could, a little. The young Marin delegate caught her eye from across the chamber and did something with its head that she thought might be a nod. She nodded back. She wrote the date at the top of the page. Below it she wrote, "Day 1 of the actual conversation." Then she uncapped her pen and the session began.